This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, June 1967, President Lyndon Johnson nominates then Solicitor General Thurgood Marshall to a seat on the Supreme Court. He was the first African-American nominee and went on to be the first African-American justice. No surprise, in the heat of 1967, this was not the smoothest nomination. Lots of pushback, lots of attempts to smear Marshall's reputation, even though he had a sterling record up to this point. And then there's this fundamental question that we will try and get into of why exactly did LBJ pick him in this moment in the first place? Here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So I am fascinated by this question. Why did LBJ do this? I guess I'm fascinated by a lot of why did LBJ do that. But let's first get to know Thurgood Marshall a little bit. I mentioned he has, a sort of monumental track record and reputation by this point already. So where do we start?
So I feel like I should start by saying my fellow Howard alum. I got to do my hair flip.
There were the Vegas bets on how long it would take for you to mention Howard.
I honestly thought we'd get past the first sentence, so bad on me.
My fellow Howard alum, Thurgood Marshall, is known as Mr. Civil Rights. I mean, if you know anything about him, typically it's Brown v. Board of Education. He's like the lead attorney on that. He's leading up tons of civil rights cases. And he has this really bigger than life sort of image. It's certainly within the civil rights movement, but his personality as well reflects that. Like, he kind of had a split personality a little bit. Privately, he's this very loud, robust sort of charismatic personality. And then in the courtroom, he's very buttoned up. He's very sort of like polished, professional, maybe even a little bit cautious. But he has these two sides of himself, and he knows how to weave in and out of Black society and white society. There are stories about him where he would like get pulled over by a racist cop and he would tell a joke and sort of charm him into either, not getting a ticket or de-escalating the situation. And then there's also moments where he's like with his Black friends and they're in a disagreement and he's like shouting the person down and, sort of taking this defiant, rebellious stance. And so he's kind of all of the above in that way.
The Supreme Court, which is probably one of the whitest places he will ever be, is his colleagues on the court talked about like how big his personality was, and they were friends. They were charmed by him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can I just say this combo of being loud and brash and a big personality in private, and then a little more buttoned up in public? That's the right combo. I think there's a lot to be said.
Yes,
there's a lot to be said for that, right? What's that phrase of like, criticize in private and then back people up in public, And I kind of feel like it's that, and I respect that. Kellie, I mean, you talked about his ability professionally and personally and just like culturally to move between spaces. There was a little bit of colorism in that as well, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he's very fair-skinned. He had straight hair. There was always sort of questions about his, parentage or his heritage. But in the Black community, I mean, he's not an anomaly. There were lots of light-skinned Black people who had either light-skinned parents or grandparents or white grandparents or parents that weren't to be discussed. And that's a part of, it's a part of the South. And it's something that I think we don't talk as much about, like colorism and how that either opens or closes doors for certain people as well. It makes people either more comfortable or less intimidated sometimes by fair skin, especially when it's on fair-skinned women, are treated differently. Like there's this whole dynamic about it. But I think Thurgood Marshall, he knows that as well, and he can play into some of that too. He can play it up and play it down as needed.
So you hinted a little bit of his background, but he's from Baltimore. Born right at the turn of the 20th century. His parents, working class, teacher and a railroad porter.
Yes, and his grandfather, who was born into slavery, had the name Thurgood, and it is after his grandfather, who he gained his freedom by escaping from the South. That's who Marshall is named after. But Thurgood is kind of a mouthful, I guess, and so when he went to school, he just kind of shortened it to Thurgood.
Can I chime in and say, if you're going to shorten, that's not much less of a mouthful.
I think it's just so many letters, right?
Yeah,
like it's 3 syllables. That's fine.
But like, if you're changing your name, just go with Thur.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say, I wonder what his nickname was, if it was like, Thur or Good or who knows? I don't know. TG, who knows?
And then he does go to Howard, of course, and then he starts to really take on civil rights cases, in the 30s, and he works at the NAACP full-time starting in the mid-30s, ends up arguing 32 cases before the Supreme Court.
And he wins 29 of them. Like, he is an incredibly successful lawyer in these cases. And I think it's a combination of both being a very skilled lawyer, the NAACP having a legal strategy where they were going to pick cases they felt like they really could win, and then the court beginning very slowly, and I think that Marshall and his cases were part of this, but very slowly starting to liberalize and to kind of open up to the idea that Black people have civil rights that should be recognized.
Of course, he's the lead attorney on Brown v. Board in 1954, which desegregates public schools, and he kind of starts to gain a sort of public reputation in addition to just a really successful track record, and I think starts to get brought into political spheres. JFK names him to the U.S. Court of Appeals in 1961. I love this little tidbit that he refused to be named to a lower court. Kennedy, I guess, wanted to appoint him to a lower court, and he was like, no. And so he ends up being on the U.S. Court of Appeals.
I kind of love that because you do get a sense both that Thurgood Marshall was willing to say no to powerful people, which is amazing. But also, like, he had a path in mind because the path that he takes, he's argued all of these cases in front of the Supreme Court. And it's very hard to get on the Supreme Court without some appellate experience. And the U.S. Court of Appeals is the best way to get that.
Yeah.
Most prestigious way to get it, certainly.
And also, he wasn't willing to take sort of like the bottom rung. He's like, listen, I've won cases before the Supreme Court. You're not just going to give me peanuts and I'm just going to be so grateful to be here. He's basically like, I've always had nothing. So it's easy for me to say no to something that I know is not going to give me the mobility that I want. But it's also kind of a boss move because who thinks, there's never been a Black Supreme Court justice before him. But to think that he's like, listen, I could be the first. This is the track that I want for myself is pretty incredible.
So then in 1965, LBJ names him the first Black Solicitor General, which means he represents the federal government in Supreme Court cases. So, his star is completely risen at that point. Before we talk about the nomination to the Supreme Court, obviously Marshall has a huge public image, and there is a lot of pushback that comes from that too. He is, I would say, one of the big sort of flashpoints for criticism and racism in this country, right? Oh,
no question. Like outside of what MLK, I think people saw him as deeply threatening to the legal process. The backlash against him is not just racial. People thought that he was trying to dismantle American ethics and that he was unchristian and that he was going to liberalize the country in ways that were just unsavory. And so he gets quite a bit of pushback. But he represents, I think, what NIki, you can talk about really well, what conservatives hold dear, which is their ability to have control over the law, like to structure policy and legislation.
And that is growing in this period. So the pushback is immediate in some ways. Like when he was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals, it was through a recess appointment because Kennedy was like, I don't know if I could get this through Congress. And so there's already a sense that there's going to be a lot of resistance to this. But there's also a growing conservative fury at the Supreme Court, the Warren Court that has handed down all of these cases that recognize the rights of people who have been accused of crimes, of women, of Black people, of all of these different groups that conservatives don't think should have their rights elevated and recognized in this way. And when Thurgood Marshall gets this pushback, there's a ton of racist pushback, but it's also this. It's like, God, they're going to get another really liberal Supreme Court justice who's willing to protect Black rights, and that's not who they want on the court.
Risk is the show where people tell true stories they never thought they'd dare to share. A podcast all about human connection and radical honesty. All through June for Pride Month, Risk will be featuring the stories of LGBTQ folks from all walks of life. You'll laugh, cry, and maybe even end up feeling a little bit better. Go get Risk on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts.
When you check in on the news each day, doesn't it kind of feel like every story is a head-spinning economic story? Tariffs, meme coins, budget fights, not to mention groceries and gas prices. Economics is everywhere, fueling our lives even where you least expect it. You're a This Day listener, which means I know you love context and hidden history. Well, Planet Money is the show for you. Planet Money recently did an episode that I absolutely loved, all about the more uncommon economic indicators being discussed on social media. Not just the obvious like prices, but sales of lipstick are going up, babysitter buns are coming back into style. A show like Planet Money is built to dig into all the little ways that economics shapes our lives. Every episode of Planet Money is fun, illuminating, and pretty short. 20-ish minutes, and you'll walk away knowing a lot more about how the world really works. Listen now to Planet Money from NPR. Let me tell you a story, a true story, about my first summer barbecue of the season. Memorial Day, 80 degrees, lovely weather, friends over at my house, I'm manning the grill. I get lots of compliments on the burgers I cooked, but the thing that 4 different people complimented me on, independent of one another, the blue polo shirt I was wearing. It is, in fact, an organic cotton silk polo, which I got for $50 on Quince. If you are gearing up for the summer, you are likely feeling that familiar urge to refresh your closet, but also not waste money on pieces that you'll only wear once or just for one season. Well, when you shop at Quince, you'll find clothes that are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It's luxury without the markup. And if my experience is any indication, you'll be getting nonstop compliments. How about that? Give your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday. So that context that, and we've talked about it so many times on this show, but, if we move into the late 60s and we get to, there's a lot of violence in 66. Obviously, 67 is notoriously brutal year of conflict and violence and racial tension. There's that larger context. And we've mentioned it a few times on the show, but also like the rise of this backlash politics is becoming a major, major force. So why, in the midst of all of that, when a Supreme Court nomination comes up, does LBJ turn to Marshall? And I'll read you his stated rationale, and then we can pick that apart. But LBJ says, I believe he earned his appointment. He deserves the appointment. He's the best qualified by training and by very valuable service to the country. I believe it's the right thing to do, the right time to do it, the right man, and the right place. So that can either sound like nothing or the truth.
I do think there's a legacy thing here, that Johnson saw himself as dismantling Jim Crow and securing Black voting rights. And here he has the opportunity with somebody like Thurgood Marshall and his administration to appoint the first Black Supreme Court justice. And I think that there is a part of him that sees that as another big victory for his legacy.
Yeah, it's a spike the ball kind of moment, I think. And I think Johnson does it because possibly he thinks that no one else will. And who knows? No one else would have for a long time.
Put a Black person on the Supreme Court.
Yes, to put a Black person on the Supreme Court. And I think it's, Johnson was always about being able to like stick it to someone and rub it in your face. And like, I think that kind of arrogance or being able to say, look what I'm going to do. And not just for like white detractors, but also so that Black people could be even more ingratiated to him, to say like, look, I've given you this civil rights bill. I've given you this Supreme Court justice. I've like, you should be grateful for me. I mean, that ties into legacy too, but that's also a part of Johnson's personality.
Yeah, and speaking of his personality, I think he also just liked Marshall. If you see a picture of the two of them together, they're both very tall. Yeah. They
intimidating.
I say they look alike, but they kind of look alike.
Little, right? A little.
And they have very similar personalities, right? Like that big gregarious personality. I think he sees something in Marshall's kind of like not impoverished upbringing, but like he comes from humble origins and he's risen all the way up through the U.S. government. And I think Johnson sees something familiar in that too.
Yeah. And I think they were both a little uncouth. You know, they both could crack jokes and sort of put you at ease, but also, you know, sort of like give you a firm handshake and look you in the eye and give you that sort of intimidation stir too. Like they both are sort of kindred spirits in that way.
Yeah. The sort of bullying and cajoling in private, certainly. Yes. Johnson is notorious for that. Yeah. Look, Johnson doesn't announce that he's not going to run for re-election for another year, and we've done episodes on that, and it largely feels like it was a decision mostly made of like the real pressures of that moment. But you can't help but think that, to what you're saying here, there's part of him that is starting to be a little more concerned or a little more kind of fixated on the larger legacy, the like just do stuff to do big stuff, because, you know, from a purely cynical, and there were voices in his ear being like, look, there's an election coming up in 1968, a year after this will hurt you. And from a purely cynical political calculation, maybe that's right, you know? And so you can't help but think that maybe there's part of Johnson that's just like, I'm not going to think about those other things. I'm just going to do what feels like it's going to secure my legacy and honors the legacy of JFK and kind of builds on all the things that I've been up to over the last couple of years. Let's talk about the pushback. No surprise. Southern senators are not happy about this choice.
Shocking, I know. And Strom Thurmond, who is, sort of the white Southern senator of the era. When he goes into the confirmation hearings, he grills Thurgood Marshall in kind of the same way that like the local registrar would for Black voters, where he's like trying to like come up with these like arcane questions and trip him up. So he asks him like, who's the committee behind the 14th Amendment? Who were all the members of that committee? And of course, Marshall actually knows this stuff. But this idea that he can push him because underlying all of that is this belief that Marshall is just not smart enough to be on the Supreme Court.
But also the kind of ridiculous notion that that they're just picking him because he's Black. And they're like, oh, is it the columnist from like a Washington columnist who basically said, you know, he's a Negro and not just any Negro, not even the best qualified Negro. And I'm thinking, okay, so if not Marshall, then who else? Who else has argued
more qualified
32 cases before the Supreme Court in 129? Like, there's no other person, maybe short of Charles Hamilton Houston or something like that, who I'm not quite sure if he's alive at the time, could have taken on that same role.
Yeah. They also, there are editorials accusing him of laziness. And this is something that, A, is wild. But B, if you listen to Nixon's tapes, he will often talk about Thurgood Marshall because Marshall's on the court by the time Nixon becomes president. And he says the same thing all the time. He also often forgets Marshall's name and just calls him that Black.
Wow.
Nixon. But like that laziness charge, you see that in right-wing criticisms of Marshall throughout his quarter century on the court.
Yeah, but
it's lazy, not bothering to learn the guy's name.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, so obviously the charges of, not being qualified are absurd on their face. And actually, not just on a qualification, from a sort of, I feel like in the Supreme Court nominations that we've witnessed in our time, you get to know these folks and realize that they are giants in their field, but they weren't necessarily household names. And I'm just curious if we could just put this in context. Like Marshall kind of was a household name. There weren't that many people who were that prominent. I mean, I don't know. I didn't know who Elena Kagan was or Sotomayor was. I don't think people knew who Clarence Thomas was outside of legal circles. No. And so it's just kind of worth putting that in context. There's almost part of me that thinks that this is not a demotion, but like a lateral move. Obviously, reaching the Supreme Court is the is the pinnacle, but like it takes him slightly out of the like public sphere a little bit. And so, just this idea that he's not like prominent enough or successful enough is ridiculous.
Yeah.
The nomination and the confirmation of Thurgood Marshall is actually another testament to LBJ's political savvy, because he, again, is overseeing this Democratic Senate that has all of these white Southern Democrats on it. And so he uses his bullying and cajoling to get like 20 Southern senators to just sit it out. Just don't vote. Let Marshall get the majority vote. The ultimate vote was 69-11. And in some ways that was like a sop to those senators, because Johnson also understood that if they were forced to vote for Thurgood Marshall, they would likely lose their next election.
And so a no vote is a yes vote. I mean, being sort of like absent is still a yes vote, but it's just incredible.
Yeah, but you're not on the record. I guess.
That's all it is.
But it doesn't show up on the campaign.
69-11. Do that math. There's some missing people there.
A lot.
Yeah. So he does pass 69-11. We don't have to get into his full legacy on the court, but any thoughts quickly on? I mean, we should say. I think Kellie, you said earlier, like, there was this question of if we don't nominate a black person to the court now, when's the next time? Well, the next time is when Marshall retires, and it's Clarence Thomas in the early 90s. So in that period, Kellie, it's a black justice. Come on, 1 for 1.
No, it should have been Leon Higginbotham. We all know this.
Oh, wow.
We all know this.
Higginbotham.
Oh man.
But any thoughts on kind of his stint on the court and whether it sort of matches, I guess, the impact that he had prior to being a Supreme Court justice?
I mean, the challenge of Marshall's impact on the court is that he comes in 67. Earl Warren leaves in 69. 68, 69. And the court begins its conservative turn, first toward under Warren Burger and then under William Rehnquist. And so increasingly, by the time he becomes a senior enough justice to write the opinions on big cases, he's writing in dissent. So Marshall is primarily known for his dissents, which are often brilliant, right? They include all kinds of sociological data, a clear moral vision, particularly in death penalty cases. So he's a notable justice, but in some ways he's kind of like Ketanji Brown Jackson in this way, right? You join the court at a moment where if you write, you write in dissent.
I also think that, I think Thurgood Marshall has a hard life in the sense that by the time he's like 58 years old, he's almost like got a complete head of white hair. Like he's stressed to the max. Like his health was not always very good. He doesn't die in office. He retires, and then he's dead 2 years later. Like this. Yeah. He dies at 84. It's a respectable age, but at the same time, it's like this was taxing on his body, on his mental and physical well-being. And I think sometimes we underestimate like people's ability to keep going in the midst of like not being able to change anything. Like sometimes I wonder, I'm glad that he was on the court, but the fact that he's constantly giving these dissenting, votes and is not able to effectively change the law like he could when he was, litigating it, I think is a big difference.
Yeah, people point out, especially given the context now, they're like, oh, Marshall retired before he died. He did, but he was 82. I mean, he was,
I know,
that is retirement age.
Like,
exactly. So,
and he was pretty sick.
Exactly.
He was.
But it shows you how warped our standards are, that we would laud him for voluntarily retiring at a sort of really slowing down at age 82.
He's retiring to run for president.
But he should have probably left 10 years earlier.
Maybe, Though who was who was president then, and there is, I guess, a question of when he retired, if he had waited until 93, maybe a Democratic president, Bill Clinton. I mean, people weren't, I don't necessarily.
Well, he died in 93.
Right. Well, that's true. Yeah.
You're really asking him to drag himself all the way to the finish line.
This is like the Ruth Bader Ginsburg thing. Like, just hold on. And
I know.
Like,
I know.
Oh, man.
So, final note, his final dissent, his final act on the Supreme Court was a dissent in a death penalty case. And that was in 1991. And we should point out that if there is a sort of legacy of his time on the court, it is really, he was a real champion of opposing the death penalty and was sort of time and again offered really sort of forceful dissents on that front. So, one in a very long list of legacies for Thurgood Marshall. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Not our first time talking about Thurgood Marshall, and certainly won't be our last. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Historians will note this hour at the White House. In a Rose Garden ceremony, a 58-year-old great-grandson of a slave is nominated by President Johnson to be a Supreme Court justice.
I have just talked to the Chief Justice and informed him that I shall send to the Senate this afternoon the nomination of Mr. Thurgood Marshall, Solicitor General, to the position of Associate Justice, Supreme Court.
Thus, the highest court in the land, with the vacancy owing to the stepping down of Justice Clark, has named to its august body Thurgood Marshall, the first of his race so honored.
Radiotopia.